As the pharyngeal arches form, which are actually responsible for the structures in the head and neck region, we have the aortic arches being formed from this aortic sac, which is the distal part of the truncus arteriosus. Truncus arteriosus, we already know, develops from the bulbus cordis, which is part of the heart tube. The heart tube gives rise to the bulbus cordis, and which has a conus and a distal portion, then truncus arteriosus, and the distal portion of that truncus arteriosus is the aortic sac. Now, this aortic sac gives rise to several arteries which are in arch-like shape, and we call them as aortic arches. Initially, these will be draining into the dorsal aorta. There are two dorsal aorta running side by side on either side of the heart and run throughout the length of the embryo. At the distal end of the pharyngeal arches, these two dorsal aortae fuse to form a single dorsal aorta caudal to the pharyngeal arches. This is a figure of the embryo showing you the heart and the there are two dorsal aortae, and ultimately they fuse and they form the single dorsal aorta. These are the vitelline arteries, and the intersegmental arteries are shown, and then there are umbilical arteries coming out of the dorsal aorta. This is the origin of the aortic arches taking place from the truncus arteriosus. The intersegmental arteries are in the various regions of the body, that is, they are present in the lumbar area, they are present in the thoracic area, they are present in the cervical area. If they are present in the cervical area, they are later on going to form the vertebral artery. In the thoracic area, they are giving rise to the intercostal arteries, and the lumbar arteries will be forming those that are formed in the lumbar area. And then later on, the dorsal aorta also gives rise to the sacral arteries, and the vitelline arteries that are present will be giving rise to the arteries of the foregut, midgut, and the hindgut. And the umbilical arteries give rise to the iliac and the superior vesical arteries, and then the also form distal portion gives rise to the umbilical ligament. Now, coming back to our main topic, that is the aortic arches, they arise from the aortic sac and they terminate in the dorsal aorta of the ipsilateral side. We already said that the aortic sac is the terminal portion of the truncus arteriosus, and these aortic arches arise from there, and there are two dorsal aortae running on either side. There are 6 pairs of aortic arches usually develop, but they're not all present at the same time. By the time the 6th pair of the aortic arches has formed, the first 2 pairs disappear. During the 8th week, the aortic arch pattern is transformed to the final fetal arterial arrangement. Okay. This is a figure showing the two dorsal aortae running on either side of the heart, and there's the aortic sac, and it gives rise to we can see the various aortic arches coming out. The first, second do degenerate, but the remnants remain in the form of the maxillary artery for the first one and the stapedial artery for the second one. Okay, so we have the different arches. We have talked about the first, second one, which get degenerated and leave behind the maxillary artery and the stapedial artery for the stapes. The third aortic arch gives rise to the common carotid, and it also gives rise to the internal carotid along with the dorsal aorta. From the third aortic arch only, the external carotid arises. The fourth aortic arch on the right, it gives rise to the subclavian artery, and on the left side, it gives rise to the arch of aorta. The fifth aortic arch it degenerates both the sides, and the sixth aortic arch, it gives rise to the pulmonary arteries on the right and the left side. The details we'll be doing in the coming slides. So derivatives of the first pair of aortic arches, these arteries largely disappear, but the remaining parts form the maxillary arteries, which supply the ears, teeth, the muscles of the eye and the face, and they may also contribute to the formation of the external carotid arteries. The second pair of the aortic arches which comes out, the dorsal parts of these arteries persist and form the stem of the stapedial arteries. These are small vessels that run through the ring of the stapes. Stapes is a small bone in the ear. Now, the derivatives of the third pair, the proximal part of these arteries form the common carotid and they supply the structures in the head. The distal part of the third pair of aortic arches join with the dorsal aorta to form the internal carotid. They supply the ears, the orbits, the brain and its meninges. So the third part has a proximal part and a distal part. The proximal part would be giving rise to the common carotid, and the distal part along with the dorsal aorta would be forming the internal carotid. The external carotid also, they say, sprouts out from the third carotid arch. This figure shows the obliteration, the dotted lines show the obliteration of the first and the second arches. The third arch is giving rise to the common carotid. It also gives rise to the interproximal part, and the distal part gives rise to the internal carotid along with the dorsal aorta. And the external carotid is coming out of the carotid arch. This is the internal and the external carotid arteries coming out, the common carotid, and they are formed from the third aortic arch. Now the fourth pair of aortic arches, the left fourth arch forms a part of the arch of aorta. The proximal part of the arch develops from the aortic sac and the distal part is derived from the left dorsal aorta. And the right fourth aortic arch becomes the proximal part of the right subclavian artery. So the fourth aortic arch forms the arch of aorta, and this arch of aorta is developing from the proximal part developed from the aortic sac, and the distal part is derived from the left dorsal aorta. The right fourth aortic arch becomes the proximal part of the right subclavian artery. So here we can see the fourth aortic arch. On the left side, it gives rise to the arch of aorta, and a little bit of the arch of aorta is also contributed by the aortic sac. But on the right side, the fourth aortic arch gives rise to the subclavian artery, and the seventh intersegment artery also contributes in the formation of the subclavian artery. This again figure shows the fourth aortic arch. It gives rise to the subclavian artery on the right side, and it gives rise to the arch of aorta on the left side. The distal part of the subclavian artery forms from the right dorsal aorta and the right seventh intersegment artery. The left subclavian is not derived from the arch of aorta. It forms from the left seventh intersegmental artery. On the left side, the aortic arch, it gives rise to the arch of aorta. The left subclavian is not derived from the arch, but it is formed from the left seventh intersegmental artery. The left subclavian comes closer to the origin of the left common carotid as the development proceeds. So here we can see the aortic arch. The arch of aorta formed from the fourth aortic arch on the left side. On the right side, it gives rise to the right segment subclavian, and also the seventh intersegmental contributes to the formation of the right subclavian. And the left subclavian is formed from the seventh intersegmental artery. The fate of the fifth pair of aortic arches is that in about 50% of the embryos, the fifth pair of aorta are rudimentary and they soon degenerate and they leave no vascular derivatives. In another 50%, these do not develop. So in 50%, even if they develop, they are rudimentary and they soon degenerate. But in other 50%, they completely degenerate and they are not formed. So the first and the second pairs degenerate, but they give rise to the remnants, they give rise to the maxillary arteries and the stapedial arteries. The third arch gives rise to the common carotid, internal carotid and the external carotid as well. The fourth arch gives rise to the arch of aorta on the left side, but on the right side it gives rise to the subclavian along with the seventh intersegmental artery. But the fifth pair of aortic arches, it does not give rise to any of the vessels. The vessels are completely degenerate. Even if they are there, they are rudimentary and they degenerate. Then comes the sixth pair of aortic arches. The sixth aortic part, the proximal part, persists as the proximal part of the left pulmonary artery, and the distal part of the arch passes from the left pulmonary to the dorsal aorta to form an arterial shunt called as the ductus arteriosus. On the left side, the proximal part forms the pulmonary artery, and the distal part passes from the pulmonary artery to the dorsal aorta to form an shunt known as the ductus arteriosus. We can see over here the lower down the pulmonary artery on the left side, it gives rise to the sixth arch gives rise to on the left side the left pulmonary artery, and on the distal part forms the ductus arteriosus, which has connection with the left dorsal aorta. On the right side, the proximal part of the arch persists as the proximal part of the right pulmonary artery, and the distal part of the arch degenerates. This is, in a nutshell, all the various arches that have been shown, and then there is a formation of the from the partitioning of the trunca and the arteriosus into your and the septum that is formed between the emerging from the pulmonary trunk. The aortic arches, these which we were talking about, how they from the aortic sac, the various arches develop, the six arches that develop, and they ultimately have connections with the dorsal aorta, which are running on each side of the heart, and they are two in number, but lower down the pharyngeal arches, they terminate and form one single dorsal aorta. This is how they have these arterial system slowly and gradually the arches degenerate, and they give rise, the first and second have degenerated and they give rise to the maxillary and the stapedial. The third gives rise to the common carotid, the internal carotid and the external carotid. The fourth gives rise to the subclavian and the arch of aorta on the left side. Fifth gets obliterated, and the sixth one also has the right pulmonary and the left pulmonary. In the left pulmonary, the distal part forms the ductus arteriosus, which has its connection with the left dorsal aorta. On the right side, the distal part gets degenerated. Now in yellow, we can see the nerves called as the recurrent laryngeal nerves, the branches of the vagus nerve. And as they run down, these recurrent laryngeal nerve forms a loop on the, and that loop on the left side is under the ductus arteriosus, which later on forms ligamentum arteriosum, but this is different on the right side. That recurrent laryngeal nerve passes under the subclavian artery. Why does it happen like that? It was because in the sixth aortic arch on the left side, the distal part of it has formed the ductus arteriosus, but on the right side, that distal portion has degenerated. So the loop goes a little bit higher and comes under the subclavian artery. on the right side, but on the left side it is a little lower and under the ligamentum arteriosum. This is the, in adult we can see the carotid and we can see the nerves, that this on the left side the recurrent and laryngeal nerve is under the ligamentum arteriosum. Why? Because the sixth aortic arch, the distal part of it, form that ductus arteriosus, which later on in adult, as the baby is born, that gets constricted and forms ligamentum arteriosum, and the recurrent laryngeal nerve runs under it. On the right side, it runs under the subclavian artery. So the following changes occur. The third aortic arch forms the common carotid and the first part of the internal carotid artery. The remainder of the internal carotid is formed by the cranial portion of the dorsal aorta. The third aortic arch also forms the external carotid. The fourth aortic arch persists on both sides. On the left, it forms part of the arch of aorta. On the right, it forms most of the proximal segment of the right subclavian artery. The fifth aortic arch never forms or forms incompletely and then regresses. The sixth aortic arch, known as the pulmonary arch, gives off important branch that grows towards a developing lung bud. On the right side, the proximal part becomes the proximal segment of the right pulmonary artery, and the distal portion of the arch disappears. On the left, it persists during intrauterine life as the ductus arteriosus, but later on it forms ligamentum arteriosum. Now we have done with the normal development of the arches, aortic arches, that is the arteries that are formed from the aortic sac, and they supply the various pharyngeal arches, and they will be running in the dorsal aortic on each side, and the dorsal aorta will unite at the caudal end of the pharyngeal arches and form one single aorta. We have done the derivatives of the various arches. Now, what anomalies occur? These occur because they has due to changes involved in the transformation of the embryonic pharyngeal arch system of arteries into the adult arterial pattern. These irregularities result from the persistence of parts of aortic arches that usually disappear, or from disappearance of parts that normally persist. So the anomalies actually occur, the parts that had to disappear, they did not disappear and they are still there, they are persisting, or those that had to be present normally, they disappear. So what are the aortic arch anomalies? We have the coarctation of aorta or the constriction of aorta, which are of two types, the preductal type or a postductal type. There's a constriction of the aorta. If it is before the ductus arteriosus, it is called the preductal type, and if it's after the ductus arteriosus, we call it as a postductal type. Then there is a double aortic arch, that is there are two arches present, and then there is a right arch of aorta. This is a double aortic arch that is formed, and it usually forms because on the fourth aortic arch on the left side gives rise to the arch of aorta, and on the right side it gives rise to the subclavian, and the seventh intersegment, the proximal portion, and the distal portion of that fourth arch, uh, persistence of the right dorsal aorta. It distal portion of the right dorsal aorta gives rise to this portion usually gets obliterated. So this forms a so we have a double aortic arch being formed. It's a vascular ring around the trachea and the esophagus. Persistence of the portion of the right dorsal aorta. It gives rise to a double aortic arch, and it will compress the trachea and the esophagus. Abnormal origin of the right subclavian artery, that is obliteration of the right fourth aortic arch and the proximal portion of the right dorsal aorta with persistence of the distal portion of the right dorsal aorta. So there's a fourth aortic arch, there's an obliteration of that, and there's an obliteration of the and there is a proximal portion of the right dorsal aorta, proximal portion of the right dorsal aorta, with and there's a persistence of the distal portion of the right dorsal aorta, which gives rise to the subclavian artery, an abnormal type of right subclavian artery, which will cross the midline behind the esophagus and may compress it. So there's a right aortic arch, fourth aortic arch, which had to give rise to the right subclavian artery, then obliterates, and there is the proximal portion of the right dorsal aorta also obliterates, and the persistence of the distal portion of the right dorsal aorta. And we have the formation of this abnormal type of subclavian artery, which may compress, which may cross behind the esophagus and may compress it. Then there's this constriction of the aorta, and we can see the ductus arteriosus, which is a preductal type and a postductal type. If it comes before the ductus arteriosus, we have there's a preductal constriction, and if it comes after the ductus arteriosus, we call it as a postductal constriction. The consequences of this coarctation is that there will be a dilated type of intercostal vessels that would be present in the person suffering from coarctation of aorta. Thank you very much. Coarctation of aorta.